Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and this week I'm joined by Brody Mullins, an investigative journalist covering business, lobbying, and campaign finance on Capitol Hill for over 20 years, and now co-author of a new book, The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. Welcome, Brody.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, it's very exciting to have you on. You have this massive new book with your brother, The Wolves of K Street. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of an intro about your journalism career first, just to kind of introduce yourself.
Great. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and I sort of caught the political bug at a really young age. For some reason, I always wanted to be a political reporter. I remember in high school reading biographies of presidential candidates and reading about presidential races and history and politics in Washington. And I realized that getting into journalism was a great way of following that passion. So I went to college in order to be a political reporter. For some reason, I always wanted to work in the Washington bureau of the Wall Street Journal. So I sort of set out my career to find jobs that would lead me in that direction. The Journal, in my opinion, always had done the best job of covering how corporations get involved in politics and how corporations use lobbyists and money to advance their interests. So I worked for a series of papers where I tried to write stories that I thought the Journal would like. So I first started covering telecommunications and the Federal Communications Commission, and I tried to write about how AT&T and Bell South and the telecom companies and the cable companies in the days before the internet, would use money and lobbyists to get what they want. And then I moved to covering Capitol Hill, where I covered oil companies and defense companies and tried to write about how they tried to use their influence to bend public policy in their direction. Eventually, I went to Roll Call and finally to the Wall Street Journal about 20 years ago, which has always been my dream job. From there, I really just try to kind of expand my footprint, writing about how companies try to get their way in DC, which I think is a fantastic beat that I've loved covering for 20 years.
And what's it like to be a political reporter in Washington, D.C.? I mean, I just have never had that experience, but what is the daily life of a journalist doing the kind of thing that you do like?
Sometimes it can be kind of madness, drinking from a fire hose, because there's just so much activity in Congress and in the White House. People constantly sending information to you, trying to get you to write stories that are favorable to the principal. If you cover the White House, there's one president and 50 or 100 staffers trying to spin you on stories. On Capitol Hill, there's 535 presidents. Every member of Congress thinks they're the most important person in the world. So you've got 535 people who are trying to spin you on stories. So the key, in my opinion, to being a successful political reporter in Washington is trying to dial down the noise, trying to sort of cut through all the incoming and all the press releases and all the tweets and all the information coming at you, and try to step back and find one good story, focus on that, get it done, and then try to find the next story. Washington is an intoxicating place. There's lots of money, lots of power, lots of personalities. And for a young reporter, it's a blast.
Yeah, that sounds like it. And I guess it's kind of one of those things where you come in with some point of view on how things work, but after 20 years or more of doing it, you might have a slightly different view, right?
That's actually a great way of putting it. I think that when people go to high school and college and learn civics courses and government courses and learn how the government works, in the U.S., you learn about the three branches of government and how there are checks and balances among those three branches. And what you don't learn about is the role of corporations. That corporations have tremendous power over not just the White House and the judiciary, but over Congress, and how laws are created and shaped. Corporations can be used for good by members of Congress to try to build alliances and build support for legislation they support. And companies can be used for evil. They can block lots of legislation, particularly legislation that helps consumers and Americans, which is a lot about what we write about in our book.
Yeah, and I think what I also appreciate about the way you've gone about it is in those same civic courses, you learn about the power of institutions, but it's not as focused on the power of people. Some of these characters in history, like Robert Moses in New York City, have so much more power than the institution that they are technically in charge of, right? I feel like looking at some of these characters is also a really interesting way to explore how power is wielded in Washington.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's something that we try to do. I mean, we're taking it, what could be a very dense topic, which is corporate lobbying, and trying to make it as interesting as possible. So we found characters who are really rich and lively and colorful who help us tell how lobbying has changed and how corporations have amassed so much power.
For the uninitiated person, just explain in a nutshell this concept of K Street. And I know that one of your big conclusions is that things are also changing, but maybe just kind of help people understand a little bit more about just how big of a deal is corporate lobbying.
Well, one of the things that we found that was pretty interesting is that there was a very, very small corporate lobbying industry for most of our country's history until maybe about the 1970s. Before then, companies did not have much of a presence in Washington. Companies generally got along with the government and supported a lot of government activity, including regulations for clean air and water. And there's sort of a general understanding in Washington and in the country through the 1970s that a lot of regulations on industry and for consumers were good. In the 1970s, things started changing. Companies thought there were too many regulations. The economy started tanking. Inflation went up. Company profits went way down. And all of a sudden, companies said, hey, how can we make more money with what's going on in our industries? And they started to blame Washington. And as a result of that, companies started hiring lobbyists really for the first time to go to Washington and to try to push back on new regulations or to get exemptions from regulations or to block coming regulations. Companies then realized that they could make a lot of money for their own companies by investing a little bit in lobbyists in DC to change public policy, to bend rules or regulations, or to pass laws that favored them. That created a booming industry of lobbyists in Washington, many of which based their offices on Washington's K Street, which was then the largest boulevard in Washington. K Street industry is basically the name that we give to the Washington's lobbying industry, just like Madison Avenue or even Wall Street. Among the many interesting things we found in researching this book is that there is nothing like K Street anywhere else in the world. Other countries don't have huge lobbying industries. And for some reason, it's really only a Washington or a United States institution.
Maybe I'm just a bit naive, but when I think of a politician, somebody who ends up in Washington from somewhere in Michigan or Iowa, they didn't set out to be hobnobbing with K Street lobbyists. Why do these tactics work on them? And maybe you could explain a bit more about what lobbyists actually do day to day. Maybe there's more mundane things, and then maybe you can talk about some of the more dark arts techniques that they use.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's two ways of answering that. First is that Washington is a very, very complicated place. The way a bill becomes law, the way a policy is crafted and enacted is incredibly complicated. There are thousands of pages of rules and regulations for how to even create rules and regulations. And lobbyists in general are legislative experts. They're the people who know how to pass laws or to work regulations through an agency. And so when a member of Congress has a bill that they're trying to pass, it's often the lobbyists who can help provide the guidance to help move that bill through the process. And therefore, members of Congress and their staffers, by the way, many of their staffers are, in their 20s and very new to how Washington works, often lean on lobbyists for their guidance on how the process works. There's also a more nefarious answer to that question, which is that members of Congress exist to get reelected. The most important thing they can do is get reelected every 2 years in the House and every 6 years in the Senate. So it means that for most members of Congress, they're constantly running for office. And running for office these days takes a ton of money. It used to take maybe 50 years ago, $20, $30, $40,000 to run a campaign to get reelected. Today it takes $2 or $3 million, which means members of Congress are constantly trying to raise money. And what lobbyists have realized is that they have access to a lot of money. So lobbyists try to partner with members of Congress and become conduits to their fundraising campaigns. So if a member of Congress has a group of 10 or 20 or 30 lobbyists, and each of those lobbyists can raise them $50 or $100,000, then that's the money they need to run for reelection. And in exchange for those lobbyists helping them, the lobbyists can have influence over that member of Congress when it comes to a vote on some industry priority. So, in two ways, lobbyists ingrain themselves with these members of Congress by one, becoming legislative experts, and also help them survive as members of Congress by giving them the money they need to be elected in the first place. So, it really creates an insidious system.
And it sounds like at no point in any of these discussions do citizens actually come into play, right? Like the stuff that's being done is for the interest of a corporation, perhaps sometimes against the interests of people, right?
Well, that's a great point, and sort of one of the central things we find in our book is that before the 1970s, citizens actually had a lot of influence. Civil rights groups, environmental groups, consumer groups had lots of influence in Washington. Ralph Nader had so much power that he could defeat General Motors and Ford on auto safety regulations, just a single person who had the support of the American public. It used to be before the 1970s that, or maybe in the 1970s and 1980s, that while companies are lobbying for policies that they want, consumer groups are lobbying against them, and unions are powerful and pushing back. So legislation was created by sort of a compromise among these really strong forces pushing in opposite directions. Now, environmental groups are not as influential. Unions have been decimated. Consumer groups aren't as strong. So the only real force on politics is companies. And therefore, companies are going to get more of what they want, and consumers are going to get less of what they want.
Are there some interesting examples? Because you talk in the book about some of these tactics used by lobbyists that are much more than just hobnobbing, this term astroturfing, the sort of dark arts side of it. What are some of the more outrageous things you've come across in your career when it comes to lobbyist behavior?
Well, we have a couple of great examples in the book about how lobbyists have increasingly tried to use the public to generate support. If a member of Congress exists, again, in my opinion, solely to keep him or herself in office, then they want to do what a majority of their constituents want. And that's their number one goal, and that's how they'll act. Lobbyists have figured this out. So instead of going to Capitol Hill with a campaign donation or buying someone a steak dinner and trying to get a favor snuck into some bill, instead they've created these sophisticated lobbying campaigns out in members of Congress district. So they'll go to a district and run basically a presidential campaign in that district. They hire pollsters and they hire campaign consultants and they hire grassroots consultants and they run TV ads sometimes and they do social media campaigns and they try to get 51% of a member of Congress's constituents to support whatever policy the company wants. And if a member of Congress thinks that their constituents are in favor of free trade with some country or want tariffs on China, that's what the member of Congress is going to do. Therefore, lobbying has really left Washington, and now it's taking place out in the states, which is fascinating.
I would imagine of the people you guys talked to, you spoke to a lot of lobbyists. I mean, did they all sort of tell you that you're overstating your point, that actually lobbyists are an important sort of interlocutor of different interests or whatever? I mean, what was the kind of experience of reporting this? How much resistance did you get trying to get deeper on this stuff?
I think we face a lot of resistance. Our book is really about 4 or 5 main lobbyists who sort of show how lobbying has changed over the years. We face so much resistance from those lobbyists that most of them didn't even talk to us. But as a reporter, when someone doesn't talk to you, it just makes you work harder and makes you find better sources who can explain to you what's really going on. So in a way, by these lobbyists not talking to us, it sort of created a better story for us because we had to find what was really going on behind the scenes. And what we found is really that the lobbying game has changed so much that it's no longer based on campaign contributions in smoke-filled rooms, that it's really about what we just talked about, trying to get constituents and voters to support or oppose policies in Washington.
It's almost like they have to create the illusion of certain truths rather than maybe it's almost too bald-faced to just buy someone dinner. I think probably there's an element of it that you're trying to play to the side of politicians that is even idealistic, right? Which is representing their people. So you create the illusion of what the people want.
Exactly. In a way, it can be democratic. If a member of Congress is following what 50% of their constituents want, I mean, that is what democracy is supposed to do. The perversion here is that companies are going to these districts and trying to gin up that support. And the bigger perversion is if 51% of the constituents don't actually support a provision or support a law, but in fact, the lobbyists are making it seem like the constituents support that position. And we found some examples in our book about that.
What's a good example of that?
A good example was a lobbyist who we write about named Evan Morris, who worked for a big biotech company in the 2000s. And in the mid 2000s, if you remember, there was concerns about the avian flu coming to America. There were a couple of deaths overseas. People thought that there was a potential for a big outbreak in the United States. This lobbyist, Evan Morris, went out and planted stories in the media about how the avian flu was coming to America and it was going to kill tens of thousands of people. Members of Congress saw those stories, overreacted, tried to find a solution. The lobbyist, Evan Morris, ended up pushing a bill through Congress to create a stockpile of Tamiflu, which fought or helped people recover from the avian flu. Tamiflu happened to be made by his company. The government then bought $2 billion worth of Tamiflu to protect against the avian flu. The avian flu never got here. No one ever died. And the government currently has $2 billion worth of Tamiflu waiting around for the avian flu. It was a masterful lobbying strategy that earned his company $2 billion, but it was essentially something based on lies.
This guy, Evan Morris, is one of the key characters in the book, and you open with him, right? That there's an anecdote about him at a Virginia golf club. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about this guy, Evan Morris.
So Evan Morris is one of the main characters in the book because he sort of shows how lobbying has changed and how the system is now broken. He started out as a young, idealistic Democrat who wanted to work for Bill Clinton and probably be chief of staff in the Hillary Clinton White House at some point. But he was sort of lured away by the promise of dollars and riches and decided to become a lobbyist instead. He came to DC at a time when lobbyists seemed to have more power than actual members of Congress and even maybe the president. He worked for one of the biggest law firms and lobbying firms in DC, a firm named Patton Boggs. He made tons of money. He became incredibly powerful through giving campaign contributions to the Clinton empire and to other members of Congress. He eventually built an enormous lobbying empire in Washington with tons of money and more than 100 lobbyists working directly for him. And he eventually spun out of control, got himself caught up in a corporate kickback and lobbying corruption scandal, and ended up dead on a golf course outside of Washington, D.C.
Burdened by his conscience, or was there a specific driver for him?
So in August 2015, Evan Morris was called into an office in downtown Washington of a prominent law firm, and he was confronted with questions about how he was spending the company's money. The company lawyers had started an internal investigation into Evan Morris without his knowledge. They saw some unusual payments going from his company to consultants. They weren't sure what those consultants were doing. They couldn't figure out what these millions of dollars were being paid for. And so they confronted him. They brought him into an office, asked him a few questions. After a few minutes, Evan Morris excused himself, said he didn't feel well, and left the office. Turns out he jumped in his Porsche. He drove to this golf course. He played around a golf by himself. No one knows what he was thinking, but it turns out that would be the last day of his life.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. And you broke that in the journal. Was it in 2017?
Correct. The story came out in early 2017. I had worked on the story for about 6 months. And after writing that story, that was the first time I sort of started thinking, hey, maybe this is something bigger. Maybe this is a book.
And that story of Evan Morris, it wasn't that widely covered in the media, right? I mean, you like you said, you had 6 months to really get behind it. That suggests that other journalists weren't really chasing it. Why do you think that is?
You're exactly right, but it was more than that. He died in July 2015. I did not hear about his death for about 6 months or so. As a reporter covering lobbying in Washington, it seemed odd that a prominent lobbyist for a major pharmaceutical company could end up dead on a golf course outside of Washington and no one know about it or no one talk about it. So when I found out about it, I gave it a few months to see if anyone was going to write anything about it. I remember being on vacation with my family in August 2016, and I realized, hey, it's been a year. No one's written about this guy. That's unusual. And when I started writing about him, one of the questions was, in a way, why does it matter that this prominent lobbyist has committed suicide? But I started making phone calls, and one of the people I called said, what are you calling me about? I already talked to the FBI. I told them everything I know. And as soon as I heard that the FBI was involved, I thought, there's definitely a story here. I didn't know what the story was, but I knew if the FBI was looking into this guy's death, it was more than just a run of the mill suicide.
No, that's fascinating. So you talked about coming into Washington to be a political reporter. At what point did your brother also join you in Washington? And did he have a different take?
It's so fascinating. Luke and I took almost the opposite approach. I was actually looking through some files the other day and saw a note I had written on a computer when I was in third grade that simply said, when I grow up, I want to be a writer. My brother Luke was the opposite. He went to school to be in education, and then he went into the Peace Corps in Mauritania, and then he went to live in the Dominican Republic. And I wouldn't say that he was lost, but he just didn't exactly have a focus. And at some point, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, for some reason, he decided he wanted to be a reporter. And he came here to Washington. And at that point, had probably been a reporter for 10 or 12 years. So I had a huge head start in that regard. And Luke eventually made his way to the Washingtonian. And even though we've written this book together, we actually have very different but complementary skill sets. Whereas I consider myself a researcher and sort of a digger and a reporter, but not much of a writer. Luke is a fabulous writer and feature writer. So when we came together, these complementary skills worked out perfectly for each other. It was sort of a perfect marriage.
And how long did it take you guys to put this together?
It took too long. Is that a good answer? I think it took us a couple years to get a book deal. We started writing, and one of the things our publisher told us, which was fabulous advice, was uh, take your time, don't rush. The longer you take, the better. So she sort of never really gave us a deadline. We started writing in 2020 or 2021 and finished last year. So it was a very, very long process. But I would argue that because it was a long process, it really helped us, one, figure out what the book was about, and two, really develop our characters, and three, string together a narrative that we think is really interesting and compelling. And also, I should say, this is not a book about Trump or a book about Biden. It's a book about what's wrong with Washington. So it doesn't need to come out this year or next year or last year. We sort of had sort of a more timeless focus here.
Absolutely. And yeah, you were hinting at the future. We're in an election year. Do you have some hope that this system that clearly got away with itself is going to get better? And what are the reasons that you might feel the way you feel about it?
Yeah, so one of the things we found out is that we're living in an era where companies have incredible power, but also that is just an era. It started in the 1970s and it may be coming to an end now. And before the 1970s, we lived in an era where consumer groups and civil rights groups and environmentalists had tremendous power. There's an ebb and flow in power in Washington. And even though I had thought that companies were always powerful here, that was not true. That this is just a temporary period of time, which it seems like might be cresting. And in the last couple of years, it definitely seems that corporations have had either less influence in Washington or certainly being attacked more by Republicans and Democrats. If you look at Donald Trump, when he came in 2017, many Republicans hoped that he would be a traditional Chamber of Commerce Republican and would support free trade and open immigration and lower taxes. And he only did one of those three. Donald Trump is very much an anti-corporate figure, and there's many in the Republican Party who are following in his footsteps. There's a group of maybe a half dozen Republican senators now who are advocating for the federal government to take on new power to fight corporate consolidation and fight corporate power, which is something that in the last 40 years, the Republican Party would be unheard of. Meantime, Democrats on the left, Elizabeth Warren and AOC, are pushing a very similar idea. that companies are too powerful and need to be reined in, and the U.S. needs to use the power of the federal government to pull companies back, which is really fascinating to me because it's just so different from how it used to be. That's just one example about how our politics is changing. The question is, how far will we go? Will we get to a point where regular Americans have more power than companies? I don't see that, but that's the trend line right now.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Brody, for sharing everything with us. Where can people follow your work? What's the best way for them to keep track of your next big project?
Well, this book, The Wolves of K Street, is available for pre-order right now on Amazon and your local bookstores or wherever you buy your books. I'm currently at the Wall Street Journal, where I have a couple more stories coming out. My brother Luke is at Politico, where he just started a few months ago, and we'll see what the future brings.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
That's it for this week. Thanks to Brody for joining us. The Wolves of K Street will be on shelves at the beginning of May, and until then, you can find Brody on Twitter/X, where his handle is @BrodyMullinsDC. The best way to stay up to date with whale hunting is to hit follow wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can also subscribe to the whale hunting newsletter for updates on the shadowy lives of the powerful and ultra-wealthy at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week for more.
Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean and Claire Urban. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.